What if I told you there was a moment on Family Feud so powerful, so real, that even Steve Harvey himself couldn't go on with the show? What if I told you that one woman's answer didn't just stop the laughter, it stopped the world in its tracks? Welcome to Harvey's Highlights, where we dive deep into the untold moments behind television's most unforgettable stories. If you haven't already, make sure to hit subscribe and turn on notifications, because this is one story you'll never forget. This was supposed to be a normal day at Family Feud. The audience was buzzing, the theme music rolled, and Steve Harvey was in his element, joking, teasing, keeping the energy alive like only he could. The two families that day couldn't have been more different. On the left, the Daniels family, loud, playful, the kind of people who made every question sound like a party. On the right, the Williams family, quieter, more reserved, but smiling with a quiet confidence that didn't need to prove anything. And among them was 34-year-old April Williams. From the moment she stepped onto that stage, there was something about her presence that made people look twice. She wasn't nervous. She wasn't trying to entertain anyone. She just stood there, calm, steady, composed. When Steve reached her during the introductions, he leaned forward with that signature grin. "All right now, Miss April," he said. "You got that peaceful look about you. What do you do for a living?" April smiled gently. "I'm a nurse." The crowd applauded. Steve nodded. "A nurse? Lord knows we need y'all. Takes a big heart to do what you do." April hesitated, then replied, "It helps when you've been on the other side of it." Steve tilted his head, curious. "Other side? You mean?" She nodded, her voice soft but clear. "I used to be the patient. I'm a cancer survivor." The audience erupted into applause. Even Steve clapped, shaking his head with that wide, heartfelt smile he gets when someone humbles him. "You hear that? A survivor. You a walking testimony right there." She smiled again, a quiet, knowing smile. But there was something in her eyes that told Steve there was more to her story. And 20 minutes later, the world would find out what that was. The next question appeared on the board. "Name something you hold on to when life gets hard." The Daniels family buzzed in first. "Faith, hope, family." The crowd cheered as answers lit up the board. It was the kind of round that made everyone smile. Then it came to April's turn. Steve turned toward her, the cards in his hand, that playful spark still in his voice. "All right, Miss April, you done been through some things, so I know you got something real for me. What you hold on to when life gets hard." April looked at him, then down at the floor. For a long moment, she said nothing. The studio went quiet. Steve lowered his hand, waiting. Then, with a calmness that sent chills through the room, she said, "The hand I thought I'd never hold again." The words hung in the air. The audience went still. Steve blinked, his smile fading into something softer, almost reverent. He took a breath. "What do you mean by that?" he asked quietly. April swallowed hard. "My husband. When I was in the hospital, the doctors told him I wouldn't make it through the night. He never left my side. He held my hand for 12 hours straight. When I woke up, that was the first thing I felt. His hand still there. I told myself if I could hold on to that, I could hold on to life." For nearly 10 seconds, no one moved. No one spoke. The audience, the crew, the contestants, all frozen. Steve put his cards down on the podium. He looked at April, then at the crowd, then back down again. "Man," he whispered. "You just—" He trailed off, shaking his head. And then, without another word, he turned and walked off the set. The cameras kept rolling, but nobody was sure if they should. The audience sat frozen, unsure whether to clap, cry, or pray. The bright studio lights that usually felt warm now seemed almost too harsh, like they were shining on something too intimate for television. Steve Harvey had walked straight past the podium, through the stage arch and into the wings. The crew followed him with their eyes, waiting for direction, but he didn't give any. For once, the man who always had a joke, always had timing, always had words, had none. Behind the set, Steve leaned against a wall, his hands pressed over his mouth. A stage manager whispered, "Steve, we can cut to commercial." He shook his head. "No, not yet." His voice was quiet. "Don't you dare stop that camera." Out on the floor, April stood still, her hands clasped together, not realizing how deeply she had shaken the room. She wasn't trying to make a moment. She had simply told the truth. The rest of her family stared at her in awe. Her husband, sitting just off stage, wiped his eyes. He had been there through it all. The diagnosis, the surgeries, the nights when she couldn't speak. And now he was watching the woman who almost died stand under blinding lights, teaching an entire nation what survival sounded like. Then, slowly, Steve walked back onto the stage. The crowd didn't cheer. They didn't move. The only sound was the hum of the lights and the faint sniffles of people trying to hold it together. Steve took a deep breath, rubbed his hand across his face, and looked at April. "You know," he said, his voice cracking slightly, "I've been doing this show a long time. I've heard just about every answer you can imagine. But I ain't never heard one that made me have to walk away." The audience laughed softly through their tears, just enough to release the tension. Steve smiled weakly, shaking his head. "You said, 'The hand I thought I'd never hold again.' That right there. That's not an answer. That's a sermon." April laughed gently, and for a moment, the room began to breathe again. Steve motioned toward her. "Let me tell you something. There's folks watching this right now, going through something. Maybe it ain't cancer. Maybe it's loss or loneliness or fear. But you just reminded every last one of us that when you hold on to love, real love, you already won." He turned to the audience. "Can we just take a second and appreciate that?" The entire studio rose to their feet. No cue cards, no producers telling them what to do. Just 200 strangers standing together, applauding one woman for her courage to say out loud what most people keep buried inside. Steve wiped his eyes, turned back to April, and said softly, "You just changed the way I see this job." The camera zoomed in on April's face, tears streaming down, but smiling through every one of them. Steve looked toward the booth. "Don't cut this," he said again. "Let it roll. This ain't TV right now. This is life." And for the next minute, there was no game show, just silence, tears, and the raw truth of a moment that had nothing to do with the board and everything to do with the human heart. Steve Harvey stood still at the center of the stage, one hand on the podium, the other holding the card he had stopped reading minutes ago. The studio had quieted completely. The usual buzz of laughter and applause had faded into something else, something sacred. April stood there, steady, eyes glistening under the lights. Steve took a slow breath. "You know what?" he said finally. "We ain't gonna play another round right now. We're gonna do something different." He looked toward the booth. "Hold the music. Hold everything." The crew froze. Producers exchanged nervous glances. But they knew better than to interrupt. Steve had that look, the one that said this isn't for the cameras anymore. He turned back to April. "You said you're a nurse now, right?" April nodded. "Yes, sir. You fight for people every day. You help them hold on when life gets hard. But I want to ask you something else." He paused. "Why did you fight so hard to live?" The question hung in the air. It wasn't rehearsed. It wasn't meant to make TV history, but the weight of it filled the room. April looked down at the floor, her hands trembling slightly, then back up at Steve. "I fought," she said quietly, "because someone else didn't get the chance to." Steve furrowed his brow. "What you mean?" "My best friend," she continued. "Her name was Rachel. We were diagnosed with cancer the same week. We went through everything together, chemo, surgeries, all of it. She was the one who kept me laughing when I thought I couldn't do it anymore. But her cancer spread faster than mine. She didn't make it." The crowd went silent again. "When she passed," April said, her voice breaking, "I wanted to quit. I was tired. But then I thought about what she told me the last time I saw her. She said, 'Promise me you'll live enough for both of us.' So every breath since then, every sunrise, every patient I help, that's me keeping that promise." Steve put his cards down again and stared at her, not as a host, but as a man who had just been humbled. "Lord have mercy," he whispered. "You ain't just a survivor. You a messenger." He turned to the audience, his voice low but steady. You see what just happened here? This lady right here, she came on the show to play a game. But she just gave us all a reason to be grateful. Sometimes it takes somebody who's been to the edge to remind the rest of us what living really means. April smiled through her tears. I didn't come here to make anybody cry, Steve, she said softly. He laughed, shaking his head. Well, you failed miserably at that. The audience broke into gentle laughter, wiping their eyes. Steve leaned closer, his tone turning serious again. You know what I think? He said. I think your friend's still with you. Every time you help somebody, every time you make somebody smile, that's her. Keeping that promise right alongside you. April nodded, unable to speak. Steve turned toward the families, his voice warm but firm. This right here, this is what Family Feud's supposed to be about. Not just winning money, not just joking around. It's about real people with real stories that remind us what matters. Then, addressing the booth, he said, I want this segment to air exactly how it happened. Don't you edit it. Don't you polish it. Just let folks see the truth. And for the first time in Family Feud history, the cameras didn't cut, the music didn't play, and the host didn't try to move things along. He just stood there beside a woman who had walked through hell and come out holding the hand that brought her back. As the silence lingered, Steve Harvey stepped closer to April. The audience, still seated, barely breathed. April, he said, his voice steady but full of emotion. You've been through more than most people will ever imagine, and yet, here you are smiling, helping others, holding on when so many would have let go. That right there, that deserves more than applause. He walked to the edge of the stage, signaling to the crew. Bring it out. Minutes later, a small table was rolled onto the stage. On it sat a simple but elegant wooden box. The audience murmured, confused but curious. Steve turned back to April. Open it, he said softly. Her hands shook slightly as she lifted the lid. Inside was a personalized journal, leather-bound, with her name embossed in gold letters. A pen rested on top, tied with a ribbon. But that wasn't all. Tucked inside the front cover was a note in Steve Harvey's handwriting. April, you survived. You fought. You lived for both you and your friend. This journal is for your stories, your triumphs, and your moments you never want to forget. Fill it, share it, and let the world see what courage looks like. Steve. April's eyes filled with tears. She clutched the journal to her chest, unable to speak. Steve smiled softly, kneeling down to her level. I don't want you to remember this show for the points or the cameras. I want you to remember that every life you touch, every patient, every friend, every stranger, that's what matters. That's your legacy. The crowd stood slowly, one by one, giving her a standing ovation. Some clutched tissues, others held hands. And Steve, he didn't just watch, he felt it. He felt the power of that one answer, that one hand held, ripple through the studio and into the hearts of millions watching at home. He turned to the audience and cameras. I've been doing this show a long time, but today I learned something new. Sometimes you gotta stop. Stop the game. Stop the music. Stop everything. And just let life remind you why you're here. April opened the journal and wrote a single word on the first page. Hope. It was simple, but it carried the weight of everything she had survived, everything she had lost, and everything she had yet to give back to the world. Steve looked over at her one last time. Thank you, April. Thank you for reminding us all what matters. And just like that, the taping ended, but the moment stayed. Not for ratings, not for the show, but for the human heart. Months after that taping, the episode never aired in its entirety. The network, unsure how to present such raw emotion, released only brief clips online. But those clips went viral almost immediately. Millions watched April's story, her quiet strength, her courage, and that one answer that made Steve Harvey pause, and were moved to tears. Fans shared the video with friends, hospitals posted it in staff rooms, and schools used it to remind students of resilience and hope. The hashtag the hand I thought I'd never hold again trended worldwide. People wrote letters, emails and messages to both Steve Harvey and April, thanking them for showing that true courage can be as simple as holding someone's hand, as profound as living for someone who can't. April herself received hundreds of messages from survivors, caregivers, and families. She said later that reading each one reminded her that Jordan, her friend, the reason she fought, was still alive in the way she lived and helped others. Steve Harvey, for his part, never forgot that moment. In interviews, he often spoke about it differently than any other Family Feud story. "I've hosted thousands of episodes," he said. "I've had celebrities, comedians, and wild families. But that day, I wasn't hosting. I was learning. I was witnessing something real. That's why I walked away. That's why I'll never forget it." Life isn't about points on a board. It's about what you hold on to when it gets hard. Months later, he sent April a handwritten note of his own, along with a journal identical to the one he gave her on stage. Inside he wrote, "Keep living, keep loving, and keep reminding the world why hope matters. Steve." April kept that journal on her bedside table, filled with patient stories, personal reflections, and reminders of how far she had come. And every year, on the anniversary of that taping, she would write a single word at the top of the page: courage. If this story made you stop and think, if it reminded you how powerful a single, honest answer can be, take a second right now to subscribe to Harvey's Highlights. Share your thoughts in the comments. Tell us what you would have done if you were in that studio, or what "the hand I thought I'd never hold again" means to you. And make sure to stay tuned. The next story on Harvey's Highlights is one you'll never forget. Remember this: the game can always wait. The heart cannot. Steve Harvey walked away that day, but what he and April created in those minutes lives on. A reminder to all of us that sometimes, the bravest thing isn't winning a game. It's surviving, holding on, and sharing your truth with the world.